Good evening, and thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight to be listening and learning, and a really special thank you to the panelists who have so graciously agreed to give us their time for such an important conversation. My name is Dee Hube, and I'll be your host for this evening's discussion. I'm a student at Duquesne University, president of the Sociology Club, and proud member of the Elsinore Benu Think Tank for Restorative Justice, which is hosting our event this evening entitled Marijuana's Disparate Racial Impacts, a Restorative Justice Issue. The think tank was formed in 2013 by 6 men serving life or near life sentences at the former Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Pittsburgh. Today, the think tank continues to center the voices and experiences of currently and formerly incarcerated people. As a diverse group of intergenerational activists, scholars, and community members, the think tank affects change in the area of restorative justice within its Pittsburgh communities and beyond. Sydney Yates, member of the think tank and graduate student of history, will be reiterating important information into the chat throughout this event. Our timekeeper for this evening will be Dr. Cindy Lacombe from Slippery Rock University's Gender Studies program. The event will run for 90 minutes and will end at 7:30. We're devoting the first 65 minutes to the panel presentation, wherein each panelist will have 4 minutes to answer each question. We will address audience questions during the last 20 minutes or so please remain muted during the speaker discussions and direct any questions you may have to Sydney Yates via the chat function. We recognize that the legalization of marijuana is a highly discussed issue, which can be very divisive. This panel is taking a different angle and will address an issue that has not received enough attention: the disparate racial impacts caused by marijuana's criminalization. We hope we can all join with open-mindedness and compassion so that together we can learn more about fairness, equity, and racial equality. The purpose of this panel is to talk about the criminalization of marijuana through a restorative justice lens. Restorative justice is an alternative community building approach to the traditional retributive justice system we have in the United States today. Rather than debating the political soundbites for and against marijuana decriminalization or legalization, this panel dives deeper to address the disparate racial impacts. Before we get started, I wanted to give a special thank you to the entire panel planning committee. I have been honored to be a part of this diverse community of faculty and students, in addition to Cindy Lacombe, Kathleen Appelt, Sarah Kuhn, Sydney Yates, Charlie Lewis, and Rebecca Lerman for making this panel possible, and to the Elsinore Benu Think Tank for Restorative Justice for hosting and sponsoring this important discussion. This panel was inspired by our dear friend Charlie Lewis. Charlie is a returned citizen from incarceration and active think tank member, passionate about speaking out to make necessary change. One day at the think tank, Charlie was describing reentry related struggles such as putting in over 200 job applications and still not being able to find employment or housing due to the stigmatization of incarceration and having a criminal record. Charlie once said, "It's ridiculous that this impacts your whole life. All they know is your criminal background. They don't even give you a chance, not for a job, not for housing, nothing." For members of Black and Brown communities, these struggles are even more pervasive. Blacks and African Americans are more likely to be stopped under pretextual conditions and are more likely to experience harsher and more severe sentences than their white counterparts, and are overrepresented in jail and prison populations. While African Americans and whites use drugs at similar rates, the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. Even though 5% of illicit drug users are African American, African Americans represent 29% of drug-related arrests, and 33% of those cases go on to become incarcerated. These impacts are why a panel with the experts is of utmost importance. Joining us tonight to discuss the disparate racial impacts of marijuana as a restorative justice issue, we have Dr. Jefferson Jalila Bullock, graduate of Harvard School of Law, is an associate professor of the Duquesne University School of Law, teaching constitutional classes. Prior to this appointment, Dr. Jefferson Bullock taught criminal law and criminal procedure in Phoenix, Arizona, where she was an active member of the law school community. We also have Lisa Boeving-Learned, who served as a dedicated police officer in Florida for over a decade until her retirement. She is also a recent graduate of Slippery Rock University with a degree in criminology and criminal justice. Tiffany Sizemore is an associate professor of clinical education at Duquesne University and is one of 9 Democratic primary winners for Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas. Prior to joining the law school, Sizemore was the Deputy Director for the Juvenile Division at the Office of the Public Defender in Allegheny County. And last but certainly not least, we have Lisa Middleman, who is also one of the 9 Democratic primary winners for Allegheny Court of Common Pleas and is a bipartisan nominee. She's a career public defender and criminal defense attorney with over 34 years of trial experience. Early in her career, she co-sponsored a study on the racial disparities in the jury selection in an effort to ensure a more representative jury panel. Please be reminded that the general municipal elections for Allegheny County will be taking place Tuesday, November 2nd. If you're not already registered to vote, you can do so at pavotes.com. The last day to register before the November election is Monday, October 18th. So plan to vote, make a plan to vote and bring your friends. And again, you can register at pavotes.com. We will now turn to the questions for this evening. Our first question. A pretextual stop occurs when police use a minor traffic violation to conduct a search of person or place for an unrelated crime, such as the illegal possession of marijuana. What role, if any, do pretextual stops have in relation to criminalization of marijuana and racial disparities? In other words, how does the law allow for police discretion when making decisions such as pulling people over, and how much discretion might police have in these situations?
And Dee, before we begin, as the timekeeper, who is always the kind of bad cop, no pun intended, I want to just make sure that Dee, that I think only 2 of our panelists are present at the moment. So I'm going to open, we'll have a little more wiggle room, which means you may have more than the appointed 4 minutes to respond. But perhaps one of you could begin by just making sure that everybody understands what a pretextual stop actually is. So Lisa, this is difficult with 2 Lisas. Lisa Middleman, if you would like to go first, that'd be great.
Okay. So what a pretextual stop is really a stop that the police make for reasons other than initially stated. So in other words, if they pull a car over for a broken tail light, their stated reason for pulling the car over is in fact to cite the driver for driving with a broken tail light. However, frequently they will try to parlay that stop into one where they can in fact search the interior of the vehicle, looking for usually guns and drugs. And that's what we mean by a pretext. They really don't care very much whether the taillight is broken. They don't intend to, they wouldn't necessarily pursue that in and of itself, but for the fact that they believe they may be able to search and find something else within the vehicle. The question was, what role do pretextual stops have in relation to the criminalization of marijuana and racial disparities? I would have to say that it sort of goes back to the over-policing of communities of color. So the notion that cars are stopped more for pretextual stops when the drivers are African-American or people of color is not necessarily the root of the problem. The problem is that the police are more heavily patrolling in urban areas or areas where people of color live. So I may see in a suburban area, no police officers when I drive through at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. But if I drive through the city, obviously, or areas where people of color live, I will see many more police officers. That being said, there is really no difference between the rate of use of marijuana of people of color and Caucasian people. However, because the police are interacting much more frequently with people of color, they're going to make many more stops of people of color, and they're therefore going to make many more arrests of people of color. Additionally, I think it sometimes has a bit to do with the communities in which the police are working. So I can tell you that probably my community or communities like mine that are suburban north suburban communities, the people who live here are not particularly concerned about the use of marijuana by individuals who may be driving through or living here. I suspect that there's a very similar feeling in neighborhoods where more people of color live. However, I think there's a greater sense of responsibility to the community in more affluent or more suburban neighborhoods. So a police officer in an affluent or suburban neighborhood may feel more constrained to keep the community happy and respecting their wishes, where I'm not sure that that's always the case in a more urban community. But maybe a former police officer would have some better insight into that.
Thank you, Lisa. I was going to say, Lisa Boeving-Learned, if you want to add to that, that would be great.
Sure. Well, to answer the question about what kind of discretion, police have enormous discretion in these incidents. Police officers are patrolling by and large on their own, or maybe with one partner. I had complete autonomy. I mean, for 25 years, I could decide who I wanted to stop, when and where, what I wanted to do. So it's really difficult to, to rein that in without training and policy to really redirect the way police officers think, because I want to make clear this discretion is absolutely essential in police work overall. But when it's used improperly, as Lisa Middleman said, that when you're in predominantly neighborhoods of color and using these tactics, that's when it becomes problematic. Just to illustrate why I said I wanted to qualify it that it's essential and pretext stops are not always bad. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, was stopped for a taillight. It is a very, very good tool of policing. The problem is that whenever you have policies of police agencies, that is by and large the case, that what we need to undo is that we have housing rules. I don't know if anybody knows this, and public housing rules say that a police officer can stop a person anytime, anywhere, for any reason in public housing. When you're on the property of the housing authority, you can do that. So that's predominantly people of color or poor people that live in housing. They are subjected to that's like slave code behavior. You're empowered to stop anyone, anywhere, anytime. Bicycle violations are another form of pretext stop, because a lot of times people that can't afford a car riding a bike, and not many people except for wealthy people that are driving around on expensive bikes have their light and their helmet, and they're stopping at stop signs and doing all these things. So these are all ways to go into poorer neighborhoods and predominantly neighborhoods of color. Just as a if we have a little bit of time here, Cindy, I want to explain something. So when I was a young officer, early 90s, my partner and I, we recognized, because we were incentivized to make traffic stops, to stop people and write tickets and arrests. And I want to be clear, my agency, big agency, well, I used to work in Tampa, Florida, it's a big agency. The measure of an officer's success and worth was tickets plus arrests divided by the number of hours you're working. So, that was it. That was the formula, So that incentivizes police officers to go out there and do, these kinds of things, because where am I going to go? If I say I had a busy night and I had a whole bunch of calls that, were non-ticket, non-arrest kind of calls, public service things that we want police to do. And I didn't have time to go do that. What would I do? I'd be thinking, oh, I got an hour left in the shift. The sergeant's going to yell if I don't get a ticket. I'm going to run right over the public housing, find a car with the taillight out, and stop that car, and something will come of it, hopefully. That is the thinking. So my partner and I, there was this one place in public housing where there was a sort of a cul-de-sac kind of, well, not a cul-de-sac, it was like a horseshoe. Well, they had a one-way sign at the one side of the horseshoe drive. And so we knew 2 o'clock in the morning, nobody was going to care. You know, people came and went in there, no traffic from both sides. But technically, if they came in from the west or the east, it was, you know, the east side, then they should have been coming in from the west side. That was a pretextual stop. So we hurried up, threw on the lights, you know, and we knew that they were selling predominantly marijuana out of an apartment there. So we would stop cars, you know, find a reason to, you know, to look in the vehicle. And, you know, then my sergeant used to joke, they're cleaning up Tampa 3 grams of marijuana at a time, because we would probably do this a dozen times a night. And we got all kinds of accolades for, you know, making a bunch of arrests, because guess what? Nobody cares what the arrest is for. It's an arrest, it's narcotics, it goes on a chart, that's it. So those were some kinds of things that, you know, that would happen. And one night, just to take this a little bit further, this example, we stopped a car, and this young white, probably 19-year-old, 20-year-old, was in the car. We decided, you know, we got it. He was buying the marijuana. We were going to just cite him and let him go. So my friend said, oh, you know, he works at the Domino's Pizza. He's a nice kid. Let's let him go. And I said, wow, we just took how many other kids to jail? The same, you know, the young people to jail. There were people of color. Why are we not transporting this guy? And then she said to me, oh, you know what? You're absolutely right. And, you know, once it was a part of the awareness of it. So, you know, that just kind of sums up a couple of the different, you know, topics I guess we'll talk about later, but that's how it works.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And go ahead, Lisa. I know you wanted to add something.
Well, I just wanted to add that the pretextual stops sometimes are also to get close enough to the car. You know, if you pull a car over, then you get close enough to the car, and all of a sudden you notice the smell of marijuana. So then that gives you, you know, your probable, or used to give you your probable cause to then search the car. But in October of last year, the Barr case was decided in Pennsylvania, which said that, well, the smell of marijuana alone may give you probable cause to search the vehicle or to search an individual, but it in and of itself is no longer sort of the golden ticket to search a car, because there are so many places where marijuana is now decriminalized or legal. You know, you can possess it. They can ask questions of the driver, and then the driver has the decision of whether or not to answer the question. So if they approach a car and they smell marijuana, they can ask the driver, hey, you know, do you have a medical marijuana card? Now, if the driver's smart and he doesn't, he exercises his right to remain silent, and they can't get any more probable cause. But, you know, we all know that people get very nervous and concerned when the police approach their vehicle. And so a lot of times people will answer the question, but remaining silent under the circumstances, whether you have a card or not, is probably the best. But, you know, our Supreme Court in Pennsylvania is changing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that with the marijuana laws changing around the country, that's one of the areas that does create some issues. I know at my former agency, they now they don't train the narcotics dogs anymore on marijuana, because it's, you know, they're going away from it. So that's just the way things are moving.
Thank you both. I did not know, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I was just going to say, it's funny because marijuana might be the only, and Lisa knows better than I do, but it might be one of the only drugs that you can say that you see indicia of from, you know, 5 or 6 feet away. or that you notice indicia of it, because you can't smell heroin from that far away, or cocaine or many other narcotics. And as a Schedule 1 narcotic, which is ridiculous, but marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug. I mean, to some people, it's a serious arrest.
That's actually a good segue into one of our next questions here. And this question is, marijuana is currently a federal Schedule 1 drug, which is the same classification as heroin. How might the criminalization of marijuana keep Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color involved in the criminal justice system?
Doesn't matter who goes first.
Right. Well, I can tell you that, and the rest of your question sort of fleshes out the use of marijuana while on probation or parole disproportionately impacts people of color. Well, there are proportionally more people of color on probation or parole. We have had, and every person who is on probation or parole is subjected to, if the court orders it, urine testing. And most of the time, judges would allow probation officers to issue probation violation warrants for people whose urine tested positive for any number of drugs, including marijuana. So if you were on probation for anything, whether it was as insignificant as stealing a pack of gum from the grocery store, or on probation for a homicide, if you came back with what we used to call a dirty urine, the probation officer would issue an arrest warrant and you would be incarcerated on a probation violation warrant until such time as a judge could see you and have a probation violation hearing. And for some people, that was months. So there's a horror story from the Court of Common Pleas here in Allegheny County that happened very recently. We had a judge who has since stepped down, who had an individual who was on probation, had never been in trouble before, but had a forgery conviction. And I don't remember what the forgery was, whether it was a bad check or it was some sort of mistake. And he was given a very lengthy period of probation. I feel like it was 7 years. And 2 years into his probation, his urine tested positive for marijuana. A warrant was issued, he was brought in, incarcerated, and this man with children and a family and a job was sent to a state correctional facility for a sentence of 2 to 4 years for the probation violation. Thankfully, when that judge stepped down, another judge was given his caseload, and that would be Judge Bruce Beamer, who's also running for election November 2nd, but he reviewed all of the former judge's probation and parole cases and immediately found a way to resentence him and terminated his probation. So a lot of what the consequences are for using drugs that show up in a drug screen are dependent upon what kind of judge you have. Do you have a judge that, is so very offended by the fact that you did not pay very close attention to him or her when they said don't, use illegal substances? Or do you have a judge who understands that certain things are not particularly dangerous or the reason to issue a warrant and incarcerate somebody? And frequently, those issues are determined by the race of the individual who appears before the judge.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm hearing someone is speaking up and I'm not sure if we can all
hear me?
make sure. Lisa, is that you or someone else? Okay. Lisa Boeving-Learned, if you want to add your answer to question number 2, that'd be great. And if you're not muted, please make sure that as a participant and an attendee, you would can mute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just unmuting. I don't know. Can you hear me now? My system froze up for a second. What I'll add to that horror story, which I could, there's lots of those around. unfortunately, is that on the other end, when we're tallying crime, this is one of the things that I'm very interested in, is that I would like to see more research done on. So another thing is just the way Lisa described that, is that, so the forgery was probably a felony arrest. Now that violation goes in as another felony arrest. And so sometimes these things are skewed. I found this when I was running our sex offender monitoring program years ago, and you'd have individuals that were on, the Megan's Law list and things for, and then they would do things like get dirty urine, as Lisa said, and then when you'd have in the statistics all these notes saying that this person was reoffended for this many felonies. When you really dug into it, it was these types of violations for the original charge, which could have been something very minor, or even like a dirty urine because they smoked a joint one night or something like that. So I find that interesting sometimes to look at. I don't know how you feel about that, Lisa, that when we're looking at crime statistics and showing that on paper, there's a lot of things that skew it. And that kind of, plays into the whole rhetoric in the debates of what we need to do about criminal justice reform. So if you want to jump in there, Lisa, and then I wanted to just add to it in my own answer to the question.
I just wanted to say really quickly that to tie back to what you said about having sort of a quota of arrests, or, that was the road to promotion, was to have a certain number of arrests. The current road to promotion in the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office is a certain number of felonies. So, while if it's all the same, we're using these statistics and these numbers to make decisions about people's futures, when we really should just be using the standard of what's best for the community or what's best for the office.
Yeah, that is so true. So if I was going to answer the question directly, the societal, economic, and personal costs, my story, the things we've been talking about so far, both of us, they illustrate this in real time. And, another factor is the officer's discretion in searching for contraband. There's a lot of studies now that have shown repeatedly that police search people of color significantly higher rates than either whether cars or on their person or whatever. NYPD got into a lot of trouble with stop and frisk years ago because the analysis now has shown 80% of those stopped were minorities. And only 12% were ever arrested. So it was just sort of like this big dragnet that they were running. My own agency got in trouble for they called the scandal biking while black. Everybody was getting stopped that was running around on a bicycle in Tampa some years ago. And I had some interesting statistics. I have a friend who was the director of an organization called the Ethical Society of Policing over in St. Louis. They did a study of all kinds of race-related things, both inside and outside of the police department. But these statistics jumped out at me and I wanted to share them here. So in 2013, this was the year that they took for these stops. City of St. Louis, there were 67,984 stops. 20,331 were white individuals, 46,066 were black individuals, 1,587 all other races. Total arrests out of the stops, 83% were black. Total searches, 5,101 searches. 75% of the black citizens were searched compared to 22% of white citizens. But the contraband hit rate, meaning finding actual narcotics or other contraband, it was 13.59 hit rate for white individuals and 11.52 for black citizens. So the hit rate on the contraband of whatever kind is fairly similar, still less for African Americans, but the search rate and the stop rate is just, astronomically different. So.
Well, and we had tactics that were used here, and they don't really do them anymore, but they used to just call them shakedowns, where the police would drive through, you know, a community of color, and just, if there was a group of kids hanging out, they would just tell them, everybody up against the wall, everybody put their hands up against the wall, and every single person would be patted down or searched. You know, imagine doing that in Fox Chapel or, you know, Pine Township at the get-go where they all hang out. It just didn't happen with the same frequency. So as a result, you know, like I said, you police certain areas more heavily, you're going to get more arrests in those areas. I think that the advent of body cameras has certainly changed some of that. I can't tell you how many times though, you know, in the 80s and 90s, in 2000s, even early 2000s, like people would tell me a police officer did this or a police officer did that, or I was the only one who was stopped. And I had no doubt that it was true, but I had no data and no way to actually prove that it was true. But now we have a lot. Now we have a lot because we have cameras.
And to build off of what Lisa Boeving-Learned said, according to a 2020 analysis by the ACLU, authors concluded that, quote, in every single state, Black people were more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, and in some states, Black people were up to 6, 8, or almost 10 times more likely to be arrested despite similar rates of use. And I did hear Lisa Boeving-Learned comment a little bit on the societal, economic, and personal costs of criminalization, but I wanted to turn that question back to you as well, Lisa Middleman.
So it's hard to calculate because it started so long ago with the criminalization of marijuana and the ease with which you could make those arrests. You know, when you arrest a man, a young man, and you sentence him to a period of incarceration, you take him away from a family, and then you reduce the source of income for that particular family, and you have children who are growing up with only one parent. And we've all seen this. Oh, so I've got dogs wrecking my stuff here. We've all seen the effects of, you know, of those repercussions of arresting people and removing them from their families. But then what you also have to think of is when you wreck families, you wreck communities. You know, and when you wreck communities, you wreck the future of everybody that comes through there. So our focus on punishment and retribution has really not served us very well in terms of strengthening families and strengthening communities. And when you strengthen families and you strengthen communities, then businesses want to come in. So you strengthen everybody's economic opportunities. And then maybe people don't have to sell marijuana in order to make ends meet, to pay for things. So it's this vicious cycle of wreckage and repair. So I'm really hopeful, obviously, that the trend has turned toward decriminalization of marijuana. And hopefully we've learned that incarceration is not always the way to benefit a community when you have a drug problem in a community or a problem with violence in a community. Sometimes healing the community is a much better option.
Lisa Boeving-Learned, I saw you nodding along over there, so I'd love to give you an opportunity to respond before I move on to the next question.
Sure, thanks. I was also going to just say that, you know, there are also things behind the scenes, policies and tactics, criminal justice tactics, and or I don't know how else to explain to them, but to describe them, but like even if it's not, like I talked about public housing, even low income housing, there's a scheme right now that I've heard about in cities all over the country that the police department can turn people in for arrests. It's supposed to be to get rid of violent people in a community, to help that community. And we certainly want to do that. But again, it's just like the stop and frisk and the other pretext stops. If we're turning in people for being arrested on a minor charge such as marijuana and abusing that power and then the landlord's turning around and evicting citizens, to Lisa's point, you are wrecking everything. You're ripping these people away from a, stable housing. How do we think that is going to help our crime? A lot of the policies that have been used and abused over, the course of, my career, and I know even before and since, that's what we need to be addressing, because we are, maybe unintentionally, but nonetheless, we are wrecking communities with this, and when it has no impact on actual crime.
And additionally, somebody with a felony drug conviction is not permitted in public housing. So, you take a person who, even when they're finished with their sentence, or even if they're just placed on probation, they no longer have a place to live and can't get the benefits of Section 8 housing, which is reduced, payment housing, or public housing. They may have difficulty getting a job. So you're really compounding, a century-old problem, I would say.
Despite this widespread use of marijuana, regardless of race, data shows that communities of color are disparately impacted by its criminalization, as we've covered so much tonight. So from a restorative justice standpoint, what do you think might provide some relief or some solutions to address these current disparities? And Lisa Middleman, just so that we have someone picked out to go first.
Well, I think that in recent years, I have seen some relaxation of the probation and parole violations for people who have marijuana in their system. And if you think about it, it is sort of ironic that it's possible that you could be sentenced to jail or prison for using marijuana. And because the metabolites linger so long in your urine, it could have been up to a month even since you used. You might be sentenced by somebody who had 7 martinis, the night before. So I think more judges are starting to recognize that. From a restorative justice standpoint, the solution is just to encourage people to find alternative ways to ease their stress other than the use of substances. Many of the folks who use marijuana do so because they don't have access to good medical care, and they don't have access to good mental health treatment. So because people are self-medicating, they have a tendency to use marijuana because it is more of a depressant and sort of mellows or chills you out a little bit. I think it's up to the court to put the use of marijuana in its proper perspective when it comes to probation and parole violations. I think it's up to the courts to stop focusing on whether they've been obeyed, so to speak. I think we have a lot of judges who are just so very personally offended, if anybody violates their probation or parole. But I have found in my years as a public defender, when I have a client who is facing criminal charges and I say, are you on probation or parole? And they say, yes. And I say, well, what judge? They say, I don't know. And I say, well, was it a man or a woman? And they say, I don't know. And I say, was it on the 3rd floor or the 5th floor? And the people say, I don't know. So judges who think they are making a giant impact with their dramatic speeches about violating their probations or paroles are really just deluding themselves, because 10 minutes after an individual leaves the courtroom, they don't know who you are. So to consider an individual who uses marijuana during the course of a probation or parole that you put them on as a personal affront is nonsensical. So we have to start understanding the way the system works. We have to start understanding the way that the people who are most impacted by the system actually view it. And we have to start including the people who are most impacted by the system in decisions about how the system is going to run. That was one, when I ran for DA in 2019, I think that was one of the most predominant themes that I sort of came up with when I was talking to people all over the county, was that people who are affected by the system need to be a participant in deciding how the system runs. And I would have to say that police officers, people who are arrested, people who work in drug and alcohol, rehabilitative facilities are not particularly concerned about people who use marijuana. I've asked police officers, and I do it just for fun now, who would you rather deal with, somebody who's high on marijuana or somebody who's high on alcohol? And I've never, ever had one police officer say, I'd rather deal with somebody who's under the influence of alcohol.
100%.
I was gonna say, we have someone who can confirm for us.
Yes, we can. And that I would echo that all completely. But from a restorative justice standpoint, we really have got to stop our entire criminal justice model, starting from the police officer at the moment of contact with an individual on the street, is all punitive arrest tickets. That's our way of solving everything. And, and part of the problem with, since in the advent, in the span of my career, we really dove headfirst into this whole broken windows policing and a fixation on the smallest of crimes. That's the theory. If anybody doesn't know broken windows policing, the theory is if you take care of the very small crimes, like a broken window, that you'll be able to address the larger issues. And that clearly, while it has its place as a start and to pay attention to communities, that is what has led us to where we are now, to where the police are called for literally everything. I've had in my career people call me and say, my 7-year-old won't go to school. The police should not be called for every single trivial thing going on in our society. So if you give police, I'd say at the policing level, I'm speaking from that, first thing you have to do is change the policies to allow officers the discretion not to arrest maybe on a marijuana charge. Refer that person to some kind of counseling, refer them, reward the police officer for not taking the speed approach. And what I mean by that is everything in our system is speed, speed, speed. Solve this problem. Don't slow it down. Don't figure out what's really going on. It's much easier to write up a quick arrest affidavit, throw the person in the back of the car, go to jail and be done. Where we're not solving anything. So if we could, right now, we arrest by default, and if in these kinds of cases where marijuana specifically, a lot of other social ills, we could require the arrest to be made only with supervisor approval. So then the supervisor would have to come on scene and say, okay, what's your other option? What other options are we going to use? And is there really no option? Oh, okay, I will sign your arrest affidavit. We could do things like that. Remove incentives for officers like myself. We shouldn't be getting, high-fived and giving officer of the month for arresting the most people with 3 grams of marijuana in their, sacks of marijuana in their pocket. We need to expunge the records of people right now, that have been caught up in the system and have had their lives destroyed, as Lisa said earlier. They're having trouble getting jobs and things. But we really, at the first level, point of contact with the criminal justice system, that's part of the retraining, reimagining policing that I like to call it, because we are what we measure, and we will repeat what we say we value. And so that's my speech on that. So.
Yeah, and so I also think that, you know, we see that people who are involved in the criminal justice system struggle with homelessness, joblessness, poverty, trauma, you know, mental health problems, addiction problems. And those difficulties seem so difficult to overcome because in order to actually address the causes of crime or involvement in the criminal system, we would have to work collaboratively with schools and the courts and communities and community health systems. And that's a lot of effort and it's a lot of work and it requires a lot of collaboration. So a lot of times people are willing to just default, as Lisa said, to let's just make the arrest and plunge this person through the system and move on with our day. But we are really not accomplishing much if we do that. At the Woodland Hills School District, the courts actually, the juvenile court actually partnered with the school district in order to try to make the schools safer, in order to try to get the police presence out of the schools, and they collaborated, you know, but we need the juvenile justice system and the adult system and the probation system and children and youth services and all of these entities to collaborate to come up with creative solutions for problems rather than just make an arrest and move on. So I guess that's the restorative justice part of it.
Thank you both for your answers. I am going to move on to audience questions in just a moment, but before I do that, I wanted to give each of you speakers, as the experts, a moment to just say anything that you feel is really important for us to know about this discussion that we've not yet asked about or added to it. Lisa Boeving-Learned, we can start with you this time.
I think we've touched on most of what I think is important, but just going back to what we were just sort of summing up there at the end is this collaborative process has to happen. We have to start looking at the underlying causes of, you know, of everything, not just the criminalization. You know, when we criminalize everything and we introduce individuals to the criminal justice system for things that, you know, are more sociological issues, I would say, than true crime. We make people into criminals, and then that, you know, sets them on a course of no return. And what I will say is that, yes, we're wanting to keep people out of the system for that, but we should always also remember that the overemphasis on policing everything puts more police officers in the face of citizens. And with our, you know, gun culture in this country, and you know, police officers having to have that real fear of every single person they talk to has a gun, the more people that you're in contact with, even if it's the most minor crime or minor thing, now that anxiety in the back of every single police officer's mind causes so many of the horrific events that we see on and ends up on our nightly news. And we think, how could this possibly happen, right? How could this police officer, you know, get scared and shoot, you know, mistake a cell phone for a gun or whatever? They shouldn't have been at the person's house to begin with in so many instances. So we really, truly can and must spend time researching all of these underlying causes to, you know, figure it out. And marijuana is just one of them.
Lisa, thank you for your insights. And Lisa Middleman.
Well, I don't really think I have much more to add other than, you know, the more science-driven that we are, and the more we pay attention to studies and science, we find that more and more of the people that you see in the courts, whether it be as a victim, a witness, someone who was accused, they are the victims of trauma. And if we become a more trauma-informed, a more holistic entity, the courts, in other words, or the criminal legal system, I think we can, and this also involves the partnership, we can partner with communities to keep people out of the system. You know, there's never going to be, I don't think that we're ever going to solve every source of criminal behavior. In other words, there are always going to be people that are dangerous, that have to be incarcerated for the safety of the rest of the community. That's not who we're talking about. We're talking about all of these other people who are not dangerous people, but they struggle with all of these societal stressors, mental health, addiction, trauma, poverty, joblessness, all that list. And you can't punish those things out of people. We've certainly tried, but you can't punish those things out of people. And I think that with greater collaboration and more people-centered solutions, we will end up having healthier communities and healthier society.
Thank you so much for adding that in there. I am going to move on to some of our audience questions, and the speakers, please feel free to jump in as you see fit on these questions. Our first question, one of the speakers mentioned that a large part of her job as a cop was making sure to reach arrest numbers. Do you think that it's possible to shift the system of policing to one that does not incentivize officers to rack up arrest numbers? Or do you think it would require a different public safety system entirely?
No, that's a great question. And I know it can be done because all you have to do is shift the thinking of police leaders. And they need to, instead of counting the input, meaning arrests and tickets into the system, the only measure of a police officer's worth, or the largest measure of an individual police officer's worth, is crime prevention and crime control. That's what we're supposed to be doing. You go back to the beginnings of policing. So Robert Peel, the father of policing, the job is to prevent crime, not to, tally the arrest and the tickets afterwards.
So, it's really interesting because I am old. I was practicing when I first started in 1986 or 7 doing preliminary hearings, which is the first hearing that you have once you're arrested. I worked at City Court, which is the busiest magisterial district justice office. And that's where all the arrests from the city, had their hearings. And there were so many police officers that would come in. Well, not so many. There were just a few, but you knew who they were. And I'm not going to say their names, but they all drove really nice cars and they brought in garbage arrests. They brought in public intox and indecent exposure and disorderly conduct charges. So they all were cases that would probably be resolved right there at City Court, but they were paid overtime. And then the hearings were always scheduled on their off days. So you got time and a half or double time, whatever it was, for appearing in court that day. And you were never in a hurry to get your case really handled. And it went away anyway. So you didn't have to go to big court or the trial courts where you wouldn't necessarily get paid, to show up. So they did stop that practice. And I can't even remember when they did, but now Pittsburgh police officers only schedule hearings when they are on duty and they don't receive overtime for it. But when I'm talking about 35 years ago, this was going on. So it's been a long time. We don't really see as many garbage arrests for the summary offenses like disorderly conduct that we used to. I'm not sure what goes on in the police departments in other parts of the county. I don't spend a lot of time there, and I don't really represent too many people who have been arrested for disorderly conduct. I know underage drinking is still big, though. It's still a staple of the communities that are outside of the city of Pittsburgh.
I would just add real quick that that was something that I know my old agency had that issue as well, with the overtime and things. But again, I think that's something that could also be addressed by, a management and supervisory change in thinking, is that, that's what your officers are doing. When I became a sergeant, there was this one young officer that, he used to come in, he used to go right up to one of the, the main intersections where he knew there was going to be, some homeless individuals, panhandling on the corner. And he would, within 5 minutes of roll call, he'd have one of these guys in the backseat of the car. And I said to him one day, I said, I know that in the grand scheme of things, it's going to go in the bucket and just tally as an arrest. But I got to tell you, if you're looking for me to give you a great evaluation and your crime fighting ability or whatever, I really don't care how many of these poor souls you put in the back of your car, because that has nothing to do with crime. And so, it's just, we just have to reimagine, I keep saying reimagine policing, and it really does need to be done. We just need to think of it, our roles differently.
Thank you both for your insights. I didn't even know about the overtime thing, so I just learned something new. I know you said that was a while ago, but still new for me. And thank you, Samantha, for that question. It was a really great question. And our next question from Joe, in reference to the path to promotion being more arrests or more felony convictions, who makes that decision? Is that something that we can try to influence politicians to change, or can you offer any suggestions as to how a person might at least question those policies?
I would say same thing. We tend to forget that in a democracy, the people decide how they're policed as part of deciding how they're governed. And so, these discussions are really helpful, because now, you're getting these insights into how the system actually works. And I think that's valuable, because then you can understand what needs change. So yes, you can say to your city leaders, listen, we don't want the police officers to be judged this way anymore. The only judgment is how they handle the community, how they help the community. What kind of good community policing did they do this month? Not how many arrests and tickets did they give. You absolutely can change the standard. It's more labor intensive maybe for supervisors, but that's part of the job. And I always say, if you build it, they will come. And if you make policing that type, there are many people who would love to come and work in a system like this to really make change.
And I agree 100%. And a lot of it is educating the public about what their rights and responsibilities as voters and citizens are. The police chief is hired by somebody, whether it's the mayor or it's a county council or a city, local council or a city council. Your political pressure on the people that make the decision change the decisions. And if you can't change the decisions, you change the person that's making the decisions. The decisions about what happens in a prosecutor's office is made by the chief prosecutor. And citizens have the right to file right to know requests, so they can get information about policies and procedures within any government office. You can get information about budgets, what part of the budget is spent for certain types of policing. You can find out whether your local jurisdiction has body cameras. I mean, there's a lot that you're entitled to know as a citizen. And we sometimes forget that all of these people work for us. Judges work for you. District attorneys work for you. Police work for you. And we're so used to just accepting the decisions of people that we think know more than we do. And I don't necessarily, I don't think you necessarily have to question every single decision that's made down to the minutia, but certainly policies, procedures, and philosophies of your leaders are things that you're entitled to know.
And if I could add one more thing on that note, is that Lisa, I'm sure you'll back me up here. This is there's this notion that, and police love to say this, I'm just going to tell you, police love to say, oh, you can't possibly understand. Our job is so hard. You can't possibly understand it. The definition of probable cause is what a reasonable person would think. So most of us are reasonable people. And so that's as basic as it gets, is that, you know, this whole, that's what I get really frustrated when police agencies and, you know, the whole criminal justice system nationwide is so resistant to this notion of like citizens review boards or citizen input. This is, again, a democracy. We decide how we're policed. We should not back away when they push back. We should not back away from that, because it will make policing better. We will get better people in policing that really want to do the job properly, and we can fix and change our system.
We have a question from Sarah that directly builds off of this. Quote, police output is mostly measured in arrests. So if police arrest a lot of people, it provides legitimization to their job and pressures officers to arrest as many people as possible. What do you think the output or measurement should be? In other words, what do you see the police's purpose as, and how do we get there and have a shift in our thinking?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? How do we make it happen? There's a program in Denver where they actually put a social worker and a mental health professional on duty at the same time as the police. And I used to have the statistics right on the top of my head, and I don't right now, but I can tell you that a significant portion of the calls that the social worker, that there were calls to 911 or calls 911 or calls to the police, I want to say most of them did not result in an arrest. So most of the time, people are not calling the police because they have an issue with a crime of violence or an actual crime. And the other thing is that we expect police officers to do jobs that they are not trained to do. You know, we don't train police officers how to be therapists and marriage counselors and mental health professionals. And we don't train them or teach them how to be social workers so they can direct people to the proper resources that they really need. And so police have one major strong tool at their disposal, and that is arrest. We need to send the right people to deal with the right problems. We need to send police officers to stop violent situations. We need to send trained detectives to investigate crimes. You know, there are jobs that only police officers can do. And those are the jobs that they need to be focusing on. We're wasting their talents and their abilities, and we're not solving homicides, and we're not solving rapes, and we're not solving and stopping the violent crime. So refocusing our priorities and having more resources for the police, or not for the police, but for an emergency response system that's not police.
Yeah, I would say that's spot on. And we need, as far as the measure of a police officer's success, you know, we talked about it a little bit earlier, the measure should be lack of crime. So I actually, and we've been talking about these things, which just never seems to get done. I was promoted to police sergeant in about 2002. And the very first thing I was asked to do was to come to address the staff of the police department by the woman who eventually became the chief, to talk to them about, you know, alternative ways of policing. And so one of the things one of the scenarios I posed is I said, okay, we're not even gonna look at crime, we'll look at traffic crashes, right? So if you tell me this is your problem to solve today, Lisa, or this month, Lisa, you and your counterpart who works on your days off, so the two of you in your zone, we want to drive down the number of traffic crashes. This is the highest traffic crash intersection in the city, right? So I decide I'm going to sit at the intersection and write my reports, be visible all the time. I'm going to be right there as often as I can be, right? And so people change their behavior, don't run the red lights, and there's less crashes, whatever. My counterpart decides they're going to sit and write tickets all month. And at the end of the month, across the board on both of our shifts, the crashes were cut in half or more. Who did their job? The answer is both of us did our job. But the point being that it doesn't have to be punitive. You can find ways to address crime or disorder or, you know, traffic crashes or whatever. Everything doesn't have to be a ticket and an arrest, a punitive solution. And the measure should be the absence of crime, because that is what, like I said, you go back to Sir Robert Peel, that's what he always said. The absence of crime and disorder is the measurement.
I just wanted to localize what you were talking about, Lisa Middleman, when you brought up the program from Denver. If I'm not mistaken, Allegheny County has a Resolve Crisis Line that's a 250 member supported by UPMC to send out. Do you know anything about that program in Allegheny County?
I know a little bit about it. I have not spoken to anybody that works there, so I don't really want to say too much, but it's any step towards resolving problems that don't require arrests. I'm willing to support.
Sorry, I was on mute myself there. We have another question from Carmela, and thank you, Lisa Boeving-Learned, for those comments. I very much agree with how that measurement was stated by you. So our next question from Carmela. Public scrutiny of the police is not new news, but certainly recent events have deterred people from enrolling into the police force, possibly people who could do the job well. Today, if you were to talk to a group of young people, how would you convince them into joining the police despite the system's many flaws? Would you even mention these flaws in recruitment?
You want me to start? That's exactly what my life's passion is right now, is to tell young people that this is actually the perfect time to join the ranks of policing, because the structures have been challenged to the point that we are more open to change and ideas, and you know, the system has been, you know, pressed enough to begin to respond to those changes. And so now new leadership is coming in a lot of cities, not nearly enough, but yes, I would bring it up. I don't think that we should be shying away from the shortcomings and the problems. And, you know, just like with our overall conversation that we're having in this country, you cannot address what you will not face. And so, you know, what is frustrating to me is that just even in the span of my policing career, going from the Rodney King, you know, incident and the beating, that horrific beating that was captured on video, and here we are in 2021 still talking about the exact same thing and still, you know, addressing things the same way. And I appreciate that we're having this conversation, because we have to, because I feel like we're sliding. Here we come a year from the George Floyd, you know, murder, and I feel like everything's sliding back to the lull and the standard of everything's going back to the way it used to be, and let's just not talk about it anymore. Some changes have been made, but not nearly enough, because we really need to crack some eggs and really get down to business of changing exactly what we think of when we think of public safety as a whole, in a holistic process, not just sending the police out to handle every single thing. Because, and I would say that in defense of, you know, all of the good people that I worked with over the course of my career, What we touched on earlier, we're sending, Lisa said it, we're sending police officers to do things that they're not supposed to be doing. And then we're faulting them when they use the only tools we've given them, which is a gun and a taser and a nightstick.
Do you think that such change is possible given the power of police unions?
I think police unions need to be reined in. It definitely is possible. We just have to find a way to keep the pressure on to make it in their best interest to change. And we have to have the courage to do it. We have to stop shying away and from the power of those union contracts. And we just really have to say, no, enough is enough. If we're drawing this line in the sand, and if you do these kinds of things, nobody can defend you. That's just the way it is.
And building on Lisa's comment now, how do people respond to pressures on arrest and quotas from the people above them and their superiors as new recruits? And what advice might you have for them?
Lisa Middleman, you want to take that?
Sorry. I think you should take that one because I have no idea. I see police all the time, but I don't know what actually goes on in the conversations that police have with one another. So I think that might be a better answer, a better question for you to handle.
That's fine. I just didn't want to monopolize the conversation now. So Dee, could you clarify, give me the question one more time again? I'm sorry, so I can make sure I answer properly.
I can jump in, Dee, since I asked it. Lisa, you have been talking about a lot of, it sounds from what you have been saying and from other conversations we've had that you think very differently from other police officers and you envision a different policing than we have had in the last 10, 20, 30 years. You said that we need to reimagine it, that we need to make changes, and now is the time to do it. And you talked about new recruits joining now to make that change. I just don't know how to make that change if you still have that culture of arrests and quotas and what do you do, especially if you're on a probationary status? How do you make that change? Because going against the subculture and the pressures from above, it's really hard to make those changes, even if you're from within and could make those in theory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So what I would say is you're 100% correct. But the thing about the day of a police officer, and I can say this with all certainty, having worked in a very busy city, there's still a lot of discretionary time. So the way that you do that, like when I came on and it was the cops office, 100,000 cops on the street, I was one of those 100,000 cops. And as an aside, when I talked earlier about the way things are presented for political reasons, I want you all to know that yes, there are problems and there are people leaving, but we're all aging out. Those 100,000 cops are me. We all reached the end of our 25 or 30 years. So it's not so much 100% this, oh my gosh, no one wants to be a cop anymore. They're all leaving. Yeah, we're all leaving because we're old and tired. So anyway, but yes, so if you are that kind of a person and you have that desire to change, like I did, we were ridiculed and mocked when we came on for, we were the community policing officers. We were soft on crime. We were the pansy cops. We were called everything in the book. And yes, I did have to go to my calls and make my arrests and write my tickets and things. But in my free time, I just chose to use it to try to problem solve in a community. And the way management can promote that is to require not just your tickets and arrests, or you've got to have a project every month. You've got to show me what measures, what crime you're, what you're addressing in your community. So, but if you're not necessarily bucking the system as a young officer, you can sort of find ways to put your own stamp on things. And I think now there's more of an openness to that, if that makes sense. So.
We have about 2 more questions from the audience here. And if there's any other questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them if we have time. Our next question is from Peg. I would like to know the general opinion now that we have medical marijuana. How do people feel about legalizing marijuana altogether, and would it have an impact on the issues we've talked about tonight?
Well, I think legalizing marijuana would have a huge impact on a lot of these issues. I don't know. I know our lieutenant governor did a big tour of Pennsylvania talking to people to see what their opinions were. And I think that he was surprised by the lack of interest in continuing to criminalize marijuana. I think that like, to wind right back to the very beginning of the conversation, you might find some folks frustrated because they can't use that smell of marijuana to search houses and cars and people. But I think that we would end a lot of that broken windows policing if we would legalize marijuana, so that the police were not even involved or participating in people's use of marijuana. The only thing is, you would always have to continue to, I believe, criminalize driving under the influence of marijuana so that you could keep people safe. But other than that, and I think we need to do a little, and this might be getting into the weeds with technicalities, but we need to also distinguish between metabolites in somebody's urine, which are no longer acting on their nervous system or on their brain, and active ingredients in blood that do actually influence or act on a person's behavior. But I don't have my finger on the pulse of marijuana criminalization, decriminalization.
Thank you. And we have, it looks like 2 more questions. We got 1 more in, and I think that'll be all we have time for tonight. Our next one is from Samantha. In the process of decriminalization of marijuana, there are a lot of people who are still stuck in jail who have served time for marijuana use or possession. How do you see forgiving these crimes that are rightfully no longer considered crimes and or paying reparations for the time these individuals lost? Is it as simple as a judge reviewing a person's charges and expunging their record, and thus would it depend on the individual judge's discretion, or how does this work? Lisa Middleman, you might be a good person to go to for this.
Well, I think that any legislation that decriminalizes marijuana will also have to have within the legislation the processes by which one would go through in order to expunge your record and or to be reviewed by the courts. So in other words, it's not as if there's a magic wand that when marijuana is decriminalized, there's a magic wand that just opens the doors of the cells of the folks who have been incarcerated for that. And you're correct. Whoever asked the question was actually very astute in considering that expungement would be part of the solution. Because like we talked about earlier, you know, if you're on probation or parole or for something, and or you have a conviction for something, it does hold you back in many areas of your life. So once the possession of marijuana is decriminalized, then those folks who actually have been paying the price for that for a very long time will also have to have that pathway to regaining their lives, which is expungement. I don't see the future of reparations for people who have been incarcerated for marijuana. I mean, we can't get reparations for people whose families were, you know, chained up and enslaved. So I think that it's going to be a very tough road for people to get reparations for being incarcerated for something which at the time was appropriate or legal to do. But the legislation should have contained within it the path forgiveness and expungement.
Lisa Boeving-Learned, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, that was perfect.
Well spoken. Our last question for the evening is from Tyler, and he said that we had talked about this a little bit earlier, but he wanted to know more about how you guys think that the public would respond to including other public servants, such as social workers, in responding to the scenes instead of only police officers. Again, the question, do you believe the public would respond well to this change? Yes, no, and why?
I think we've already seen the public wants us to do that. And I think Cindy put in the chat here somewhere about the Cahoots program, and I apologize. I was trying to find, I made some notes on a panel that she had last year in the Cahoots program. I mean, one of the things that, again, to educate the public, they have shown over 20 years that they've saved millions and millions of dollars in what is it, Eugene, Oregon, Bend, Oregon, somewhere like that. But they have a track record now of 20 years to be able to show how beneficial a program like this is to the community in terms of handling things properly, you know, non-criminalizing, and then ultimately saving, you know, a ton of money. And so I think if the community was given this real information, instead of it just being this, you know, all or nothing, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, you know, tiresome argument that is getting us all nowhere. If we really started embracing, you know, the data, and I'm praying that we're going to have a lot more research on all these things that come out, and so that we can have a better educated public on this.
And I think Lisa's absolutely correct. Education of the public is crucial. You know, nobody wants to get rid of police. Nobody wants to end funding to police. Well, some people do, but the majority of folks don't. What they want to do is add tools to the toolbox of the emergency response system that are more designed to deal with the problems that the people who respond actually face. And I think that the success of these programs will be very helpful. And honestly, people don't sometimes pay a lot of attention unless they think it's going to save them money, or unless they believe that it will affect them personally. So a lot of folks are not, you know, criminal justice reform minded because they don't know anybody who faces the criminal legal system, and they don't have any personal stake in it. But I think when you start talking about money, most people perk their ears up, and if they're taxpayers, and start thinking about better ways to do things that can save them money.
Lisa, I would like to ask you, I'm sorry, Dee. I'd like to ask you a question. No, it's not going to be that question. It'll be, do you think the sentencing guidelines in the 80s that was brought around had a lot to do with the amount of incarceration of people that have from marijuana? First offense, marijuana. Okay, what are they getting sentenced to? They have to follow the guidelines. So, you know, they're kind of created their own problem here in a way. I mean, you just got done talking about the money being spent, taxpayers are spending. It's because of the guidelines. You're given longer sentences. And in the 30s was when they criminalized marijuana, by the way. And yeah, you were saying you didn't know exactly when. But and one other thing, what can we do about getting marijuana out of the same category as heroin and opioids and cocaine? I mean, it's in, you know, it's Schedule 1. What could be done about that?
Well, I can tell you there's a man named Patrick Nightingale who runs an organization called Pittsburgh Normal, but NORML. And he runs the Pittsburgh chapter. I would suggest you get in touch with that organization. and see what you can do to volunteer to help, because he is doing everything that he can to try to push that legislation. I believe there's some legislation currently pending. And I can't remember who sponsored it, but there's always legislation pending. What we need to do is get rid of the folks who are in the legislature who keep blocking that legislation. And once again, that's educating the public so that they know that they can vote people in or out who will do the things that they want to do.
Yeah,
But I
I'm
would
sure you could
yeah.
talk to a lot of the other judges. I know that, some of them are still in that old time fashion, that old time
Well,
boys club,
If we get 10 new ones, we weren't invited to the club. So we've got 10 new ones coming in, and hopefully if we get the right ones, we can influence policy decisions at the common pleas level.
Well,
That's-
it's kind of a kind of nice that you're involved in it, because well, from just talking to you and that, I feel that you might want to make some kind of changes in that. And you're in a position to do these things.
Right. That's why I'm running, to get in a position where I can make lasting change. And with 10 new judges who will be on that bench for 10 years, we have an amazing opportunity. So that's why, at the risk of plugging, I'm like the person that goes on the Johnny Carson show and plugs their movie. Like, let me just plug the election real quick. This is why it's so important to vote, because voting decides who your mayor is, and that tangentially decides what kind of police policies you have. City council decides those things. County council decides those things. Those folks are all up for election, as are judges. So, you may think these people don't influence your day-to-day life, but if you think it's important to vote, tell 30 of your friends it's important to vote, and make sure you do whatever you need to do to help get them to the polls. Because
I'm sorry I jumped in like that, but
that's all right. We need to run this show, not the politicians.
I'm terrible at typing. I couldn't type in the chat for D, so I had to jump in. Plus, I like saying hello to you. I like talking to you. Very good.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks for jumping in there, Charlie, and thanks so much for answering his questions. That was a good one. Please remember that you can vote in the November 2nd election if you're not already registered. October 18th is the last day for registration in order to vote in the November 2nd election. PAvotes.com will get you everything you need. It's also a mayoral election, so please be there. Please vote. Tell 30 of your friends to vote. And thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you so much to the panel planning committee who helped make this possible.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.